to Elixir Mix, your weekly Elixir podcast talking with members of the community. My name is Mark Ericksen, and on our panel today we have Josh Adams.
Heyo.
And today we have two special guests. Could you guys introduce yourselves?
Sure. I'm Barak Karavani, VP of Engineering at Car Labs.
I'm Kevin Moore. I'm a full stack engineer at Car Labs.
Great, and we're glad you guys could come on and talk with us about some of the exciting stuff you've been doing and releasing as open source. And so it's a great opportunity, I think, to kind of highlight these different projects in the community. And so why don't you go ahead and just tell us what this project is. It's called Gremlex. Is that right?
It is. So Gremlex is an open source driver for the Gremlin Tinkerpop query language for graph databases. Our goal was to make it easy to make queries against the graph database from an Elixir application rather than just writing raw queries.
Yeah, that sounds perfect. Yeah, we wanted to have a nice library for composing queries similar to like Ecto or things like that, and also have a language driver that's kind of similar to other driver in other languages such as Python or JavaScript or Java.
Great. And so for our audience, those who aren't familiar with graph databases, could you just kind of give us a high-level kind of intro as to what graph databases are and why I might care about using one?
So graph databases are, I guess they're schema list databases with an emphasis on the relationships between the objects in the database. So what's great about them is that you're able to create relationships between any of the vertices in the database, and traversing them is a very cheap cost versus compared to typical like relational databases where joins can often be expensive. So typically if you're what you're focusing on is the relationships between data, then graph databases are great for that.
Some of the classical solutions that are pitched for graph databases are social networks, recommendation systems, and just some security concerns also.
They're also used for building ontologies for data sets as well.
So the more deeply connected your data points are and the distance between them, the better solution a graph database might give you. Which is why we use the graph database for our chatbots. Okay, so
one of the things you're using it for is a chatbot then, because I was wondering what application you guys found that this was a good fit for. So yeah, could you tell us a little bit about what kind of, like what it's doing there and how it's being used as a chatbot?
Sure. So probably talk about a little bit about our company. So our company is called Car Labs, and we build chatbots or digital assistants for the automotive industry. So we work mainly with OEMs and like car manufacturers. So Kia Mexico, Honda. We're working with a few others, and so we're building chatbots for them. And so one of the things is our first iteration of the chatbot was we had these when we went from kind of like a generic chatbot, which was our prototype, to something that was more geared towards a specific OEM or client, was that we had to write kind of validation rules to say, when a user was asking for a specific vehicle of that client, for example, if you're Kia and you're asking about the Optima or the Stinger or the K900, we wanted to present them with, not just like kind of a very generic answer, but an answer that was more geared towards that model of the car that they were asking for. So one of the things is we were kind of baking in all these routing rules, but the problem is with baking in those routing rules is that it didn't allow us to, obviously this wouldn't scale because these rules were written in the code and they're kind of like, conditional statements. So we took a look at those conditional statements and saw how we can kind of abstract them and see how we can store them in a way where they could be more dynamic and editable. And we wanted to store them in a database. And we felt that the schema that they provided in the rules, the kind of the routing felt natural to a graph database.
This episode is sponsored by Sentry.io. Recently, I came across a great tool for tracking and monitoring problems in my apps. Then I asked them if they wanted to sponsor the show and allow me to share my experience with you. Sentry provides a terrific interface for keeping track of what's going on with my app. It also tracks releases so I can tell if what I deployed makes things better or worse. They give full stack traces and as much information as possible about the situation when the error occurred to help you track down the errors. Plus, one thing I love, you can customize the context provided by Sentry. So, if you're looking for specific information about the request, you can provide it. It automatically scrubs passwords and secure information, and you can customize the scrubbing as well. Finally, it has a user feedback system built in that you can use to get information from your users. Oh, and I also love that they support open source to the point where they actually open sourced Sentry if you want to self-host it. Use the code devchat at sentry.io to get 2 months free on Sentry's small plan. That's code devchat at sentry.io.
So you're using Elixir, obviously, for this, because this is an Elixir library. So one of the questions I had, I guess, is, so where does your solution, is this like something that would be on a dealer website, or where would they interact with this chatbot?
So we're actually not on the dealer website, but on the automotive website, the manufacturer's website itself. So Kia.com, Kia Mexico's homepage, and then or on their Facebook pages. So Honda, for example, is a Facebook-only chatbot, so it'd be on their Facebook page, and then as well as Kia and Kia Mexico are on their Facebook pages as well too.
So all of these OEMs are using a chatbot. Each one of those are communicating with our graph database, which is on AWS Neptune, which is a new hosted graph database solution that AWS came out with. So we have multiple clients, bots, communicating to the same graph database hosted there.
Okay, and that database stores what kinds of things? I mean, obviously relationships, but...
So specifically, the way that our graph is architected is that we have a client vertice, so that defines which client it is that we're speaking with. So whether that be Kia or Honda, and that way we know which data we're going to be working with for the rest of the query. So then we have all of their intents. So by intents, we mean something like maybe the user's requesting details of a car or requesting a specific attribute, or maybe they want to schedule a test drive. So that definition, it flows down from there. So it's client to intent. And then we look at what we have in the user's state. So we might have their name. And then let's say if we don't have their zip code, we ask them for that. So the flow of the graph defines this structure. So we go down and we say, okay, you are scheduling a test drive. We need your address. Let's ask the user for their zip code. Now that we have their zip code, we need to ask the user which dealership they want to schedule the test drive from. And so all of this data is driven through the graph, and that's how we're able to make it dynamic and not hard-coded. So if we ever needed to make a new conversation path, we add it through our CMS, which populates the graph and the flow trickling down and picking up the parameters as we go along.
Okay, cool. So you have something like a declarative description of like what it means to schedule a test drive, and then you have some flows that say, here's how I get the data that I need to fill in the blanks.
Yeah, kind of like slot filling, or exactly like slot filling.
So one of the things you mentioned in there was Amazon Neptune. That's a service we have a link to that in the show notes, but that's not a service I've actually used, but it is for graph databases that are like, I imagine like RDS, where I could have a Postgres database instance. It's an Amazon provided graph database that I can interact with. And so is that why you guys chose to use the Gremlin or Tinkerpop one? Because that's the one that is behind the scenes, or how does that, what's that relationship like?
Yeah, so originally when we started with this, we've been trying this process called like ADRs, or architecture decision records. And it would be that someone proposes kind of a solution in an ADR. And so for example, we call it our validation service, which uses the graph database. And so there was an ADR with using the graph database for the validation service. But the graph database in that ADR was actually Neo4j at the time. But before we went into production, we obviously did a couple prototypes just to test this out, to see if it was feasible. But before we went into production, we wanted to kind of check out all the graph databases available to us, and taking into consideration things like costs, deployments, maintenance, administration, all sorts of things, right? Because, running a prototype on your laptop is different than, serving production instances and things like that, and especially when clients are paying SLAs. Yeah, so
it's practically the same thing, right?
Yeah. So, we took a look at that, and, Kevin actually did a lot of the research as for which different databases. I know we looked into, so there's Neo4j, there's dgraph, there's OrientDB was one of them. And then right as we were doing this research, Amazon had actually just announced Neptune at their not this last year's reInvent, but the year before. So they had announced Amazon Neptune, and it actually turned out, one of the great things is that, it's managed. We wouldn't have to kind of worry about it. And then, you have all things built in, like snapshots, and then loading, like bulk loading data. And so as well as being in, setting it up within VPC, subnets, different availability zones, replication, all, those sorts of things that you consider when going into production, right? And so it actually, I think, was also the cheapest alternative for us as well, too. So it had, the fact that it was backed by Amazon, it was in AWS, we're in AWS, it's managed, and it was a cheaper alternative. So it really seemed to check all the check boxes for us.
And that is the reason why we chose Gremlin, because it's Gremlin and what else?
Sparkle and Gremlin, I believe, are the two languages query languages that they support. When we first did the prototype, Neo4j they have their own query language called Cypher, and then they also support Gremlin as well too. So
that's interesting. I didn't know there was. I don't have as much practical experience using graph databases. It's one of those things like I've always been aware of. And it's like, yes, when I have a problem like this, I will jump for that. And I just haven't had that yet. Not to say that I couldn't have better solved existing problems with a graph database. That I might just be holding on to adding one extra join too many times, right? But.
Yeah.
Well, I've used a graph database exactly once, and it was just to examine a big data set. So not a really solid use case.
Yeah. Well, hopefully with Elixir and Gremlex, just spinning it up is super quick and easy. That's why we put a lot of resources into writing some documentation, writing some articles to hopefully get people up and running, because since graph databases aren't used everywhere like you might have with a traditional Postgres or relational database, we wanted to try to make that barrier of entry a lot smaller.
So one of the things that was interesting there that you'd mentioned was that Gremlin is a query language, and I didn't realize that was a query language that multiple graph databases would support. So that was interesting. So that using the Gremlex library, I might be able to talk to various different backend databases. Is that right?
Yeah, I believe that, Neptune supports it. Gremlin has a Gremlin server built in. Janus Graph supports it. I think, was dgraph also? I don't remember I don't remember what dgraph's query language was, but I think one of the things of Neptune is, or maybe, I don't know if this is, one of their goals, but at least to me is what it seemed like is kind of being the standard, graph database language or query language. So I know that a lot of graph databases do support Gremlin, so.
One thing that we've been finding interesting while developing Gremlex, since we are first developing against our Neptune cluster because we need to support our needs first, is that we have discovered that Neptune has their own specific implementations of Gremlin. So we have been trying to support the Neptune variation as well as the default variation. So let's just say, for one example, is that the Gremlin local server generates IDs that are just numerical, whereas Neptune is a
UUID.
Yeah, UUID. So with Elixir, we needed to make sure that we handle those kind of use cases. And there's a few other things like cardinality of properties on the vertices. Neptune treats it slightly different than the base Gremlin variation.
So one other thing I wanted to ask about is this idea of other people might be interested in playing with the graph database and saying, hey, this might be a good solution for us. And I'm just wondering, with your situation, are you exclusively all of your data is in the graph database, or is it like we also have another more traditional RDS that we're using as well? Because I think that is a valid situation where people can say, yes, I have all of my customer data and traditional relational database over here, and then I have what's more about my relationships like those things that graph databases let me query faster, find relationships and find connections better, and even connection strengths, and being able for recommendations. I might be able to use both databases. Is that something you guys are already doing, or what kind of advice would you give for someone who's interested in kind of maybe bringing that in?
Yeah, actually, that's exactly what we're doing. Our applications use mostly Postgres databases. There's some MySQL. So, the CMS, for example, is the application that we use to talk to, that speaks to the graph database and actually has the API to interface with it. And that application uses both a Postgres database and the graph database. So for the content side of things, all of that stuff is stored in the Postgres database. But then, like we said, the validation portion and the rules stored for our validation service are in the graph database. And we do, there is some complementing between the two of them.
So what he means by that, for example, is when a user goes through our graph validation, they'll eventually get to what we call an action. And an action is a reference to the Postgres database of which content to serve up. So the graph doesn't have the actual content. So if somebody says, is requesting details of the Optima, the graph doesn't say, oh, the Optima is this MSRP and has this information about it. What it really does is it says, okay, tell our chatbot to request the action name from our Postgres CMS.
That's cool. That makes sense. So I also know that you mentioned that the company behind this is, what was it again? Car Labs?
Yeah.
Right. And so this is, I don't know, would you consider, because you guys as the company has officially allowed this to be open sourced, this library. It's like, you could argue that it's a competitive advantage, right? That you'd have this library to make it easier for you to work with the Neptune service and graph databases. But, the company's chosen to support the open sourcing. I was wondering if you could just kind of talk about that and what that was like, that process.
It seemed like almost a no-brainer for, it was the decision was really from our CTO. And so, and we're all big proponents of open source here on the engineering side. I imagine most engineers are, right? So I think when we chose to open source it, I think it was just something that it didn't really seem like a question. There is, I guess you could say that, it did give us a competitive advantage, but by open sourcing it, we also gained a lot of things as well too. So one, it just made kind of the project, really fun to work on and interesting, for all the engineers here. Everyone feels like a very sense of ownership and pride. It's actually gotten us to teams to think about other things that they can open source as well too. And the company is, very okay with it. I mean, we're not, open sourcing our entire application, so I think that's okay. And so they didn't feel that it was something that was kind of giving away too much. And we also gained a lot from it by, open sourcing it. This is really exciting for us to be here. Like I said, our team felt a sense of ownership. We actually were, our application was forked and new features were added to the driver. So, sorry, not application, but Gremlex was already forked and new features were added to the driver and merged back in upstream. And so there's support for a lot of complex things like nested queries now. There was some function, we implemented the functionality that we needed immediately, and we were gonna, over time keep adding more functionality. So people started already implementing that and opening PRs and stuff. So it was really exciting. I mean, we even have members of our team that have contributed to the Ecto repository as well too. And so, we use open source technologies. We try to support, we want to try to give back to the community as well too. So this was one way, and it was just really fun and exciting. So, and I don't think the company felt that we were hurt by it by any means. So yeah.
I feel like the other reason why it's easy for us to agree to open source Gremlex is because it's a tool. It's a general tool. It's not a specific feature of what our chatbots are able to do. Because the reason why we built Gremlex is because we knew it was going to be a challenge to generate all these queries that we need to make. It's a very specific algorithm to go through the graph from beginning to end and to loop back through it. So we needed the tooling to accomplish that. So when somebody gets their hands on Gremlex, it's just a way for them to come up with their own solutions. It's very far-fetched that the solution that we came up with would be close to another solution, because there's so many possible ways to create chatbots using graph databases. Our variation is just one that we decided based on our needs and our use cases.
That's awesome. Well, I'm really glad that you guys open sourced it and that you found benefit also in seeing a benefit to the company for having open sourced it. I think that's great. I'm also a big fan of open source. I use an open source programming language called Elixir. And I use, like, my laptop runs Linux, and yeah, so I love it.
This episode is brought to you by TripleByte. Applying to programming jobs sucks. You have to put the right keywords in your resume. You spend hours and hours on the phone screens and take-home projects, and that's assuming the company even responds to your application. Well, if you're a software engineer, TripleByte can help. They work with over 400 top tech companies, from big names like Dropbox and Adobe to exciting startups. You do one brief online interview with them, and if you do well, you go straight to final interviews with the company on their platform. It's like the Common App for software developers. TripleByte does not look at your resume or where you went to school. All they care about is if you can code. I've helped dozens of software developers with various credentials get jobs, and this looks like a terrific way for you to get in and get interviewed and get a job without a lot of the hassle and overhead. You can go check them out at triplebyte.com/elixir. That's triplebyte.com, byte as in 8 bits. As a special offer for listeners of this show, if you take a job through TripleByte, they'll offer you a $1,000 signing bonus.
I was just curious also, were there any special considerations? Like if someone is working at a company and they would like to, they have some like small, I don't know, libraries or tooling that they think, this would be great as an open source thing. I mean, it sounds awesome that your CTO was the first one who's a proponent or supporter of it. But if someone was, like, what kind of licensing did you choose? Like for the license for the library, is it like MIT, or what kind of considerations would a company have? Any thoughts on that?
For us, the MIT license was like the obvious choice. I don't think we had any discussion around it otherwise, because it was always meant from the beginning to just be shared across the board. We didn't really want to license it directly to us. We know that would bring down the usage. And, when I was pitching the whole idea of like open sourcing as much as possible here, one of my biggest reasons was that we take advantage of a lot of open source projects, obviously, like you said, Elixir, but I think everybody really, you just look at your dependencies, whether it be on Elixir or on like Node, and that gets heavy really quick because you're taking advantage of all these open source solutions. So just MIT was just a very obvious choice for us personally.
I think also too is that, we had to audit our dependencies as well too, to make sure that they were also using valid licenses. So I think we already went through that pain, where we saw like, we got lucky where I think there was only like a very few amount of dependencies that we had across all of our applications that weren't, with, that had, pretty liberal licensing. So I think we didn't want to, inflict that same pain on people where they had to, choose they had to, fight with the licensing of, of a dependency. We really want to be more useful and kind of be out there. So.
Yeah, I think that if, one of the concerns is how do I get my company to agree to and accept open sourcing products because of concerns like competitive advantage, is that more likely what's going to end up happening is that you end up getting, like, not to sound selfish, but free work. Like Barak mentioned, once we open sourced this project, it was actually insanely quick, where another company came in and added support for nested queries, because before they came in, all we had was just any functions that Gremlin supported as it piped through the next one. But we didn't have a concept of a function that takes in additional functions. So for example, in Gremlin, you could repeat over a query. So you say like, repeat out of this vertex 5 times until you find somebody with the name Barak. And and we didn't support that. So once we open sourced it, once we wrote an article on it, got the name out a little bit, then at that point, somebody issued a PR, and now we have this feature, and we didn't have to do too much. We're a startup, so we have a ton of work to do, so we can't always be dedicating a ton of work. So, getting your company to understand, hey, we get free work, we get free recognition, because, I'm not saying that it's because of this, but our CTO ended up presenting at the AWS conference the other week, and AWS has shown interest because of the article as well. We're getting a lot of attention from a lot of different places, just like from you guys as well. Now our name is out there even more. There's so many benefits. I don't think anybody's worried about our loss of competitive advantage from a querying language against a graph database.
No, I agree. And yeah, I don't think there's no business logic. There's nothing special, like no secret sauce. So
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, definitely more people should open source projects for the chance to come on this podcast. Yeah.
I think the only thing that with open sourcing is that you feel that you now have a responsibility to the community, and it's just, you have to make sure that you document things, and functions are documented. You have documentation. A website usually helps, things like that, and you try to be respectful of versioning, semantic versioning, so you don't break people's applications in production and stuff.
But it makes you better for yourself as well. That's actually the thing I like the most about it, is like, I know other people are depending on this, so I have to care about them as much as I should have been caring about future me anyway.
For sure. And definitely, one of the things too is that, it wasn't just kind of like an overnight thing. We just didn't decide to, flip the switch on the repository to make it, public versus private. But, we did, create tickets and prioritize them, put them in our sprints, and, they're simpler tickets and a little bit on the lower priority of things, but, we still try to pull them into the sprint because we thought they were important. And, it's kind of like getting a buy-in from the company of just like having, 1 to 2 tickets per sprint, adding some documentation, making it more open sourceable, things like that, until we felt ready. And, then we were able to kind of make it open source. So
that is awesome. So I really appreciate, because it like you're saying, you're describing some of these things and you get a lot of these benefits. And I wouldn't be surprised at all if you have people who enjoy or were maybe persuaded to come work at the company because they see these things that you're doing, that, there is like some sense of ownership and some contribution to something like that. I was wondering if you could kind of talk us through some of the other features that Gremlex has. So you mentioned that it has like this composable queries. Like, what are some of the other features that someone would be able to look forward to using in this?
So I guess one of the, as you said, the big features is like composable queries. And so what's nice about that is, probably my favorite part is just that the way you write queries is really nice. And, we really took advantage of the pipe operator and of building a data structure for that kind of gets passed between all the functions for composing a query. So what's nice is that you can just you are able to create different parts of the query and reuse them, but it also your code looks really nice and easy to decipher when reading. It's like very, very similar to writing a Gremlex query, where instead of using the dot operator, you'd use the pipe operator. So that's really nice, and also made it actually really easy to test because of the fact that it was every function just basically returns a new data structure, so we're able to unit test really nicely. We also have the ability, so as Kevin said, that we did add the support for nested queries. We're using connection pooling underneath. And so what's nice is with supervisors and connection pooling is that if you lose connection to the database, it'll automatically restart. So kind of the things that you expect from a kind of a production database driver. So, and then I'm wondering if the support for dropping down to raw queries in the case that you need them as well too. And then we try to kind of be nice about returning a nice data structure, so a vertex or edge data structure, which you can use, in your applications. So those are kind of the big things, I guess, that features of Gremlex.
This isn't really a feature of Gremlex, but I do want to call it out just for any future users, is that one thing that we were able to take advantage of within our application is Ecto change sets. So we did define some Ecto change sets to limit what kind of properties could be set on a vertex or on an edge. But looking to the future, I was kind of thinking, which we haven't like agreed to anything yet, but one of the features that I wanted to potentially do first class in Gremlex is to be able to define past a vertex properties or edges. So let's say, for example, for our use cases that we do have very strict rules of which edges can come in and go out of a vertex. So I kind of wanted to define like an equivalent chain set to describe the rules of, we could only have one edge coming out of this node, or we could only have up to 5 edges coming into this vertex. So I kind of wanted to experiment with having first class support to easily define these to make it a little bit more structured and protect us from ourselves while developing.
I am impressed that you made change set support. That is awesome, because I love change sets. They're incredible.
Yeah.
Having come from like Ruby and Rails, where you have, the model manages this state of like, oh, I have a modified this, customer name has been modified, and now I have an error on it. And it's like, I just love the way change sets solve that elegantly. So I'm really impressed that you even had the thought to say, yeah, let's do that. And so great.
So if somebody wanted to like just get started and pull in Gremlex and do something with it, is there a good like getting started blog post or tutorial?
Yeah, the introducing Gremlex Medium post that I believe is how you guys discovered Gremlex. That actually has a pretty good introduction of what it is, how it works on the back end, and then more importantly for what you just mentioned is a very quick, like, this is how we use it, where we showed you like how to write a function that generates a vertex, a function that generates an edge, a function that creates a relationship between them, and then a composition from creating a vertex, passing it through to creating a relationship between the two nodes. So I feel like that's a good place to start. Also,
and if I'm getting started developing and I'm not talking to Neptune immediately, what would you recommend I run locally to run Gremlex against?
So if you look on the Tinkerpop website, Apache's website, they actually have a Gremlin server that you can download, and it's just and it just has like a binary, and you could just start up a local Gremlin or graph database that you can use, and Gremlex just connects right to that. I think the defaults actually connect directly to that, so on port 8182, and so that's actually what we use for development locally, so we don't have to connect to Neptune for development.
Yep. There's a couple of links called out to those references in the blog post as well. We don't document exactly how to configure those, but we link to it, and it's pretty simple.
And I was curious about what the testing story is. I know with normal Ecto kind of thing, like I have transactions, and after a test is run, it rolls it back. Is there any like test support for Tinkerpop and Gremlex, like how I might run automated tests?
So for Gremlex, what we do is we actually use Docker containers. And so we essentially spin up a Docker container with the Gremlin server, and we'll run tests against there. And then when the tests are done, it destroys the containers. So that way, but yeah, we don't have support for anything like kind of like a transaction where it would run it in a transaction and then revert it back. Transactions work a little bit differently in a graph database. So
Sure.
Yeah. So yeah, and that's the thing. So that's how we kind of handle any kind of like integration tests. Is we'll usually run them in Docker containers.
And when it comes to local development, sometimes what we find is that we don't want to have the tests run against our local database, just in case if we want to preserve any of that data. So what we suggest to our developers is that they create a separate test configuration, and the local Gremlin server will be separated from your development one. So we usually switch over that test configuration locally, run the test there on a clean environment, and then switch it back when we go back to normal development. That's what we do locally, at least.
Okay.
Great. I remembered something I was going to ask, which was, I don't know if people take a time to like dig into Ecto, where you can see the Ecto query is a struct, and you were kind of describing that you just developed a struct that represents this Gremlin query that can be passed down, kind of piped through. I was just wondering, did you take much inspiration from Ecto Query and the Ecto library itself?
Well, we knew that we wanted to store the query in a data structure. And so Q actually seemed to be the best data structure for us because of the fact that we kept kind of needing to it was first in, first out type thing. And so it was the way that we were building the query. So we actually are using Erlang queues for storing the data structure as the data structure for the query. So if you look actually at the functions in Gremlex, one of the things that was really nice is that using this queue, if you wanted to add new functions or new language functions, it's essentially was just enqueuing the name of that function, the name of the Gremlin function, and its arguments into the queue. So yeah, it was actually really simple. It was just basically storing it as a tuple, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
That's cool. I was curious what your experience has been with Elixir and with this company. Like, how did you choose Elixir and say, yes, that's a good fit for what we're trying to do?
So I started learning Elixir back in 2015. I think it was around like 1.4, 1.3 or 1.4 had just been released, or maybe 1.2. So, but I was actually working at Edmunds, and I was under the operations team, and I was, on call was kind of very stressful, and I was just, if there was a way to have, 99 applications with great uptime, and so and just building scalable applications with a long uptime period. And so I started looking, and obviously Erlang comes up, and then I found out about Elixir, and I just was really impressed by it was also functional programming, and I was really big into functional programming, still am really big into functional programming, and so I just started learning Elixir and just started messing around with it as on side projects and things like that. And then when I came to Car Labs, we actually wanted to write we knew we needed to write a CMS, and I was kind of working on it at home on a side project. And, I just for fun, I was writing it in Elixir. And before we introduced it into the company, I cleared it with the CTO to make sure it was okay. And, we looked at obviously the pros and cons of it. And so, one of the things is that, there is no silver bullet, but one of the great things about Elixir, right, is that, if you're writing a web application, especially, now 2018, 2019, right, Elixir seems to have everything that you're going to need, right out of the box, and so the idea of, having long running processes, being able to use that for caching or for side jobs. So you don't need to use external things like, queues for for different things. Being able to, as being able to communicate, for example, for stateful requests, like even for caching, like when you want to clear. So being able to broadcast that out to multiple nodes, just long uptime, the fact that, a single request doesn't kill your application, all those sorts of, so you don't need to rely on external things like PM2 or something like that to make sure that your application stays alive when it dies, things like that, because requests are isolated. So all those sorts of things, we really love the pros of that, but obviously it's the fact that it's not as well known as Python or Node or even PHP, I guess, or things like that. And so we did have to look into that, but we said that when we were hiring, we were kind of, rather than, hiring for a specific language or things like that, we just were looking for people who, with the ability to learn and, or who wanted to learn, and especially learn new languages, and kind of, and it didn't seem to be that hard of a language to kind of have people come in and pick up and things like that. So, and there's a ton of resources for learning Elixir. I started with the programming Elixir, the Prog book. And so, we had that here, shared it around. And so people were learning from that. And so it wasn't too bad as far as introducing Elixir into the company. So
nice. So are there any other resources you would recommend that you either use as when you're helping with onboarding, that you're helping to teach people, Like, you recommended the Programming Elixir book from Dave Thomas. I got that in the show notes. Is there anything else that you say, yes, this is a good resource, or we officially provide this resource, or anything like that that you would recommend?
I think I just have like a couple of blog posts like bookmarked sometimes. And so sometimes when people run across things, and I'll try to remember if there's a blog post. I really like the Platforma Tech blog. I think one of the other things too is like when you're, debugging things or trying to do remote IEX sessions and stuff. So they have a great blog post on that. I'll try to find it and send it over. But yeah, that's one of my favorite ones. I know that I think Yuri, also from Platforma Tech, just released a blog post on writing a custom MySQL driver, which is, that's a really great series. So, that set of their blog posts. And then I think also read the Little OTP book was also another good one for kind of driving in those OTP principles as well. And then was there another book about macros? I believe I also bought. It's been a while since I read it, so those are try not to use too many macros, but just always good to have in your back pocket. So.
And to be honest, here when we hire new people, and I'm speaking from personal experience when it comes to Elixir, just we throw them into the code base, and Elixir is good enough that we could typically pick it up, and then like some of the shortcomings that you need to learn about, like pattern matching, if you aren't familiar with those, are usually picked up in code review. So just Elixir is that easy, in my opinion.
Yeah, I think we also make pretty good use of pair programming as well too. So sometimes if anyone's stuck, we all always love to just kind of like, scoot on by with our chairs, or, hop on a Slack screen call and stuff and just try to, help out each other. So yeah, I think, probably just, I guess each other being the best resources as well too. So.
Yeah. So it sounds like pair programming is a large component, and also it sounds like you may have some remote workers. And so you're doing pair Slack, and you're also doing code review. I think that was I think it's a great way to learn.
It is.
I agree.
That's really where I learned most of my biases from coming from different languages. I was throwing in way too many conditional statements into a single function, and somebody was like, no, just use guards. Okay, cool.
I also think, oh, now I lost my train of thought. Sorry, apologies. There was one more thing I thought about, but then now it just slipped me. So I'll try to, if I remember, bring it up. Oh, sorry. Now I remember it. I apologize. Static analysis tools as well too are actually really helpful as well. So, there's, I think, Credo, for example, which has some best practices and will let you know when, your case statements are too nested, or, and you may need to break it out into like kind of like a with statement or multiple functions or things like that. So
do you take advantage of Dialyzer?
We do add the type specs to our functions, but we're currently not using Dialyzer. We're using Credo with the format, and we actually just started integrating so below as well too. So for security static analysis as well too. I do know that people have in their IDEs that they have the type spec support. So there's also that, so that we do gain that by using by adding type specs.
Yeah.
Personally, when I come for local development, at least early on, I use VS Code as my environment, and I use a VS Code plugin called Elixir LS, and that tells you a lot about like what you might be doing wrong. It is a little noisy, but it does teach you a lot about what kind of mistakes you might be making.
I do just want to give a +1 to the library you mentioned, Sobolo. Like I've worked in I like the last two companies deal with compliance, and part of the compliance requirement is you have to say, yes, we are on every commit or with regular frequency, we are doing security analysis of our code, and automated security analysis. And just having that library exist allows Elixir to be an option for different environments. So I just want to give a +1 to that. I love it. Just if nothing else, it has actually found issues for me and be able to resolve stuff for other people's code. Like it's great to find things, but if nothing else, it helps check that box. And yes, I can use Elixir now on this project.
Yeah, no, it's definitely a great library.
All right. Well, is there anything else that you guys would like to talk about or highlight?
I was going to say maybe one more thing about using Elixir in our company is one of the things is we wrote a test suite for with using Elixir. When we were talking about macros, it just kind of reminded me. So one of the cool things is that we built, for our QA team is a set of macros for us to be able to run integration tests against the bot and for them to kind of come up with easy conversations. And so by using macros, it does something where it creates a new user, creates a request for a new user, and then we created like really simple functions that you could use in the macro, kind of like just like message or click button or click quick reply button. Those the simple things that you could do, so we can emulate a full integration test suite with that, and allowed our QA team to write tests really easily for kind of testing different workflows and paths throughout the bot. That's another way to introduce Elixir into a company. So just the ability to do that. And then maybe one more shout out for macros was just we built an SDK. I built a while ago an internal SDK for one of our applications, and macros actually made it really easy to kind of model the exposable functions and stuff because they're all very similar. So rather than having to write a ton of functions, macros were able to generate them out for me. So but those are, I definitely think that test suites may be a great way for introducing Elixir into a company. So
was there anything else that we want to talk about before we go to Pics?
I don't think so. I'm good.
All right, let's go to Pics. Josh, do you have one for us?
I have a pick. So I recently added just a little Elm thing to, I guess two picks. So one is the Torch admin generator from Infinite Red for Phoenix apps. So it's just a typical admin CRUD generator. It works rather nicely just to make a quickie admin. And it's easy enough to wire into, like we have a separate data layer, so it's easy enough to tweak the generated code. And then it actually produces the generated templates for you if you want to run your generator, so you can change it to generate something more appropriate for your actual use case, which is really cool. And inside of it, we're embedding this Elm app for some support chat stuff. And so I wanted to share this article on getting started with Elm 0.19 and Phoenix 1.4. It's just a really solid, hey, if you want to combine these two things, here's the easiest way to do it using kind of the built-in Webpack stuff in Phoenix 1.4. And it's super easy, probably easier if you didn't generate without Webpack initially like I do. But anyway, it's a really good article, very, very actionable if that's your cup of tea. And it very much is mine.
Great. The one I was going to pick today is, so I run a Plex media server at home for family movies and a lot of like the videos that I rip of our DVDs and Blu-ray. And so I just wanted to pick the tool I use for ripping Blu-ray is MakeMKV. And that's at makemkv.com. It is commercial software. You pay for a license, but I have used that frequently for backing up DVDs that I have, and because I hate pulling out a DVD and having to get through the menus to watch a movie. It's like, no, I just want to be on my, ready to go on my media server. And, that's also the way it's like, I'm not going to open up a CD to look at like that Pixar short that I wanted to show somebody, like show the kids. And I'm not going to do that. But when it's just easy on a media server, I love doing that. So MakeMKV for ripping Blu-rays that I legally own. So that's my pick. All right, Kevin and Barak, I'd love to hear what you guys have.
Okay. So I've been doing Advent. This is my first time doing Advent of Code. I know I started a little bit late. I actually started after the 25th, but better late than never. And one of my things was I wanted to do it in Haskell. So I guess one would be Advent of Code, and then part of learning or doing it in Haskell would be the Haskell book, or Haskell from First Principles, and it's at haskellbook.com. And then there's Learn You a Haskell for the Greater Good, also at learnyouahaskell.com. So I've been using those two books for trying to write Haskell development, or for writing the solutions to Advent of Code in Haskell. So yeah, it's great. It's hard. Those problems are challenging, and writing them in Haskell is even harder, but it's for a fun challenge. And so there's a lot of things to learn from type safety and Haskell. So yeah.
Cool. Kevin.
So I've been slowly getting through a book called Category Theory for Programmers. I'm not going to butcher the author's name, but I'll give a link to that to you guys. But there is an unofficial book that is based off of his blog post, and he also has some YouTube videos of him teaching a course. It's great to read because it kind of puts you in understand a mathematical way of composability. So it's great. I mean, it's great for any kind of programming paradigm, but functional programming especially, it's actually been really cool for that. And I'm also reading another book currently called Nudge, and that's not really about programming, but about how small nudges can make a large impact in people's lives, whether it's by influence or so forth. It's a very powerful thing. It's great for coming up with ideas for design decisions and so forth. Yeah.
Great. Well, it was a pleasure talking with you today. If people would like to follow you online or connect with you, where should they go to do that?
Yeah, I don't have too much of a social presence. I guess I have a Twitter that I don't use. And then my blog is actually down, and I'm trying to work on getting it back up. So having some domain issues. So, but I guess just Barakyo, Barakyo on GitHub, I guess would probably be the best place for me.
Yeah, kind of the same story, but my Medium profile, if anybody wants to follow, whether it be the Car Labs Medium profile or me, I'm also on the handle on GitHub, KevMoJ. So yeah, thank you.
Awesome.
Great. Well, that's it for today. We hope you'll join us next week on Elixir Mix.
Bandwidth for this segment is provided by CacheFly, the world's fastest CDN. Deliver your content fast with CacheFly. Visit CACHEFLY.com to learn more.